October 1942, Leningrad. The siege perimeter is a frozen scar running across the Russian earth. Under the low, steel-gray overcast of an autumn morning, 4 full Werfer regiments, roughly 200 launchers, sit silently in the mud. They are positioned in a firing line that stretches for kilometers, their split-trail carriages dug into the freezing soil to absorb the recoil of what is about to happen. The crews have spent the last hour unlimbering. They have dragged the 540-kilogram weapons off their wheeled towing carriages, heaved the trails apart, and cranked the elevation mechanisms to the precise angle dictated by the firing charts. In the chamber of each of the 6 tubes sits a 15-centimeter Wurfgranate 41 rocket. When the order comes, it does not sound like artillery. It sounds like a mechanical scream. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. In a span of 10 seconds, 1,200 rockets ignite. The sound is a rising, oscillating shriek generated by the exhaust venting through 26 angled nozzles. It is a noise that Soviet soldiers describe as the sky tearing open. The rockets arc over the no man's land, leaving thick, ropey trails of gray smoke that hang heavy in the damp air. To the men on the receiving end, the psychological impact arrives seconds before the high explosives. The sound alone is enough to freeze a man in the bottom of his foxhole. When the rounds impact, they do not dig craters like conventional heavy shells. The warheads are fused to detonate 1 or 2 meters above the ground, turning the air into a chaotic web of shrapnel. A grid, square the size of 12 football pitches, is saturated with shockwaves and steel. But back at the firing line, the terror of the launch has been replaced by a frantic, terrifying calculus. The crews are not celebrating the hit. They are looking at their watches. The same rockets that just devastated the enemy have painted a giant gray arrow in the sky, pointing directly at the German position. The smoke trails are visible for kilometers. The flash was unmistakable. The crews now have to reload. They have to muscle fresh 34-kilogram rockets into the 6 tubes. They have to endure 90 seconds of frantic activity at a position that every Soviet artillery spotter in the sector has just identified. And even after they fire again, they cannot simply drive away. They are tethered to the ground by their own engineering. This is the paradox of the Nebelwerfer. It was the most accurate, most terrifying area denial weapon of the early war. But it was built with a fatal flaw. It was a weapon that screamed its presence to the world, yet required 5 minutes of heavy lifting to hide. In the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front, that was 4 minutes too long. To understand why this weapon was both a masterpiece and a death trap, you have to look inside the rocket itself. The 15-centimeter Wurfgranate 41 was an anomaly in rocket design. Most rockets of the era, including the American bazooka or the British rockets, placed the explosive warhead at the front and the rocket motor at the back. German engineers, obsessed with precision, did the opposite. They placed the rocket motor at the front, essentially pulling the warhead behind it. The warhead was located at the rear. The exhaust gases from the nose-mounted motor had to go somewhere, so they were vented through a ring of 26 nozzle holes, venturies, positioned 2/3 of the way down the rocket body. These venturies were canted at a sharp angle. As the exhaust blasted out, it spun the rocket at furious speed, roughly 145 meters per second of rotation. This spin stabilization made the Nebelwerfer incredibly accurate for a rocket weapon. While other rockets tumbled and strayed, the German rocket drilled through the air like a rifle bullet. But physics demands a price for everything. The air rushing through those 26 angled nozzles acted like a siren. It created the signature screaming noise that gave the weapon its allied nicknames, Moaning Minnie or Screaming Mimi. More dangerously, the intense spin and the forward motor placement created a massive, persistent smoke signature. When a battery fired, it didn't just produce a puff of smoke. It generated a dense, helical column of exhaust that pointed straight back to the launcher. On the steppes of Russia, where the horizon is flat and unbroken, a Nebelwerfer volley was a visual announcement that could be seen from the next postal code. The launcher itself was the second half of the problem. Known as the Nebelwerfer 41, it was a 6-barreled cluster mounted on the carriage of a 3.7-centimeter anti-tank gun. This was a legacy of the weapon's secret development. Nebelwerfer translates to smoke launcher, a cover name used to fool League of Nations inspectors into thinking Germany was building defensive smokescreen devices rather than offensive artillery. The anti-tank gun carriage was sturdy, but it was designed for a gun that sat still and ambushed tanks. It was not designed for shoot and scoot rocket tactics. To fire the Nebelwerfer, the crew had to stop their truck, unhook the launcher, spread the heavy steel trail legs, dig the spades into the earth to prevent the weapon from flipping over, and level the sights. After firing, they had to do it all in reverse. Collapse the trails, lift the heavy carriage back onto the truck's tow hook. This process took a well-trained crew roughly 5 minutes. 5 minutes is not a long time in civilian life. In counter-battery warfare, it is an eternity. Contrast this with the Soviet solution. The Red Army fielded the BM-13 Katyusha. The Katyusha was crude. It was essentially a steel rail rack, bolted to the bed of a simplified tractor or a Lend-Lease Studebaker truck. The rockets were fin-stabilized, not spin-stabilized, making them notoriously inaccurate. They wobbled in flight. They dispersed over a wide area. But the Katyusha had one advantage that mattered more than accuracy. It had an engine. A Soviet crew could drive to a firing position, unleash 16 rockets in 10 seconds, and be driving away before the first rocket hit the ground. The entire cycle, stop, shoot, move, took less time than it took a German crew just to unlimber their weapon. The Germans bought accuracy with time. The Soviets bought survival with mobility. As the war turned against Germany, the bill for that accuracy came due. The invoice arrived in early 1943. By this point, the shock of the screaming weapon had worn off. The Red Army had captured launchers at Velikie Luki and realized the super weapon was just a clever piece of engineering. They stopped fearing the scream and started using it as a targeting beacon. The turning point was the Battle of Medanine in Tunisia, March 1943. This engagement serves as the perfect case study for the Nebelwerfer's decline. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel was launching a desperate offensive against the British 8th Army. To support the attack, Werfer Regiment 71 was brought forward. The terrain around Medanine is flat, hard-packed desert scrub. There is no cover, no forests to hide in, no reverse slopes steep enough to mask the flash. The German commanders deployed 3 batteries of Nebelwerfers, 18 launchers, in the open, hoping to saturate the British anti-tank gun lines. At 7 a.m., the sun rose over a cloudless North African sky. The German launchers were sitting ducks, their silhouettes stark against the desert floor. When they opened fire, the result was catastrophic. The clear air magnified the flash. The lack of wind meant the smoke trails hung like pillars. British forward observers didn't even need to use complex triangulation. They could simply look out their binoculars and see exactly where the fire was coming from. More importantly, the British had total air superiority. Within minutes of the first salvo, a flight of fighter bombers and heavy artillery zeroed in on the smoke. The German crews tried to relocate. This was the moment the design failed them. As shells began to bracket their position, the crews had to run through their mechanical checklist. Close the breech, crank the traverse, lift the trails, drag the carriage to the truck. They never finished. Counter-battery fire and strafing runs decimated the regiment. 18 launchers were destroyed or abandoned, their twisted frames left on the desert floor. Werfer Regiment 71 was effectively erased from the order of battle in under 10 minutes. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution of obsolete doctrine. The disaster at Medanine was not an anomaly. It was a preview of the Western Front. By 1944, during the Easy Normandy campaign, the Nebelwerfer faced a new enemy that made the visual smoke trails irrelevant: radar. The British had deployed the GL Mark III radar system, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, but adapted for locating mortars and rockets. The Nebelwerfer rocket, with its spinning metal body and slow, high arc, was a perfect radar target. In the hedgerows of Normandy, a Nebelwerfer battery would fire. Kilometers away, a British radar operator would see the blips rise on his screen. Before the German rockets had even reached the apex of their flight, the radar computer was calculating the point of origin. Coordinates were relayed to heavy artillery batteries. 155mm or 25-pounder shells were often in the air before the German rockets had impacted. German crews in Normandy reported a terrifying phenomenon: airburst counter-battery fire, arriving while they were still reloading. The British and Americans were using the Nebelwerfer's reload time against it. They knew the Germans needed 90 seconds to reload and 5 minutes to move. So, the Allied gunners would time their response to catch the German crews in the open, exposed, wrestling with heavy ammunition crates. The screaming Mimi had become a trap. The crews began to fear their own weapon. Some units started using field-expedient tactics to survive. They would set up the launchers, load them, wire them for remote detonation, and then retreat to a bunker hundreds of meters away before firing. They treated the launchers as disposable because operating them in person had become a suicide pact. The Wehrmacht tried to adapt. They recognized that the towed carriage was a death sentence. Their solution was the Panzerwerfer 42. This was a heavily armored half-track, the Opel Maltiel, with a 10-barreled 15-centimeter launcher mounted on top. It was the German answer to the Katyusha. It could fire and move. It had armor to protect the crew from shrapnel. It was, on paper, the perfect evolution of the system, but it was too little, too late. German industry, pounded by strategic bombing, could only produce roughly 300 Panzerwerfers. They were excellent weapons, but they were a drop in the ocean compared to the thousands of towed launchers that the infantry still had to rely on. The disparity in production numbers tells the final story of the war. Germany produced approximately 5,769 Nebelwerfer launchers of all types. They produced about 5 million rockets. These are impressive numbers for a specialized system. The Soviet Union, however, produced over 10,000 Katyusha launchers. They produced rockets in quantities that made counting them almost irrelevant. But the most damning indictment of the Nebelwerfer came from the Germans themselves, specifically the Waffen-SS. By late 1943, SS units on the Eastern Front had seen enough. They watched their precision-engineered Nebelwerfers get bogged down in the mud. They watched their crews get cut to pieces by counter-battery fire while trying to unlimber. And they watched the crude, ugly Soviet Katyushas fire massive barrages and vanish into the forest. So, the SS copied the enemy. They created the 8-centimeter Raketenwillfachwerfer. It wasn't a German design, it was a direct copy of the Soviet BM-8 Katyusha rocket, rail-mounted on captured French half-tracks or German mules. The fact that the elite units of the German military, the ones who claimed racial and technological superiority, resorted to photocopying a crude Soviet design speaks volumes. They realized that in the mud of the Eastern Front, a weapon that worked good enough and survived was infinitely better than a weapon that was perfect and dead. The Nebelwerfer remained in service until the very last day of the war. During the Battle of Berlin, in April 1945, disparate crews dragged their launchers through the rubble of the capital. In the urban ruins, the long-range sighting and the complex ballistics were useless. They fired over open sights at Soviet tanks down the street. At this close range, the scream was deafening. The rockets, designed to stabilize over kilometers, often failed to arm or tumbled erratically when fired point blank. When the war ended, thousands of these launchers were found abandoned across Europe. They were found in ditches in Normandy, left behind when the retreat moved faster than the towing trucks. They were found in the snow of the Ardennes. They were found twisted in the Tunisian desert. The Nebelwerfer was a triumph of engineering over reality. It achieved exactly what it was designed to do: deliver a massive, precise payload with a terrifying psychological impact. But it was designed for a war that Germany wanted to fight, a war of set-piece battles and clean maneuvers, not the war they actually got. The war they got was a war of attrition, mud, and overwhelming firepower. In that war, the Nebelwerfer was a liability. It was a weapon that demanded a perfect environment to function, while its rival, the Katyusha, created its own environment. History remembers the sound. The screaming Mimi is a staple of every World War II movie and video game. It is the audio signature of the German war machine. But for the men who operated it, that scream was the sound of a stopwatch starting. A countdown that ended with a counter-battery shell. The mathematics were simple. The Nebelwerfer needed 5 minutes. The enemy needed 1. And in the end, the timeline of the Nebelwerfer simply ran out. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.